In this video, I'm gonna share a story about some clients that I'm currently helping out, and I'm betting that many of you watching this find yourself in the same exact scenario as Scott and Shelly. They currently own their house, they've been there since 2010, but it's time for them to move on. But how do you navigate moving from one house to the next house, especially when you need the equity in your current home for a down payment and you don't want to be homeless in the process? So how do you do all this? Is it even possible? So Scott and Shelly are in their early 60s. They've owned their current home since 2010. They love their home. This was their dream home. They loved raising their kids in this house. It was a great house. But here's the thing, guys, is that Scott and Shelly, just like all kids, they grow up and they leave the nest. And so they find themselves in this larger home on a larger property. And so they've decided that they want to sell and buy another house. Like most people, the bulk of their wealth is the equity in their home. And they need that equity in order to be able to complete their next transaction. So how do you make it happen? The chicken before the egg. How do you get that equity without actually having to sell first before you're able to buy? Because first off, who wants to be homeless, right? You got to have a place to live. You've sold your house, now you're waiting to buy your next house. That's not ideal. Nobody wants to move twice. And the other dynamic that Scott and Shelly have to navigate is, as a buyer, they have to make a decision. Do they want to be contingent or non-contingent on the sale of their current property? Meaning, basically, when they write an offer to buy a house, the seller has to accept the fact that they still need to sell their current home to close the deal. Obviously, that makes them less attractive as a buyer. And if they're competing with other buyers who are not contingent, well, they're probably not going to have their offer accepted. So how do they make it to where they don't have to be contingent upon the sale of their property and buy their next house? What's the solution for Scott and Shelly's scenario? If they decide that they're going to be contingent, they're not going to be as competitive as a buyer, but they don't want to deal with the associated risk and cost of not being contingent, that obviously is the best scenario for Scott and Shelly, but probably not for the seller. So they'll have to see how that plays out. But it's totally possible to basically get in a contract where you're contingent upon selling your current property and basically do those transactions simultaneously. Then you don't have the conundrum of how do you tap into the existing equity in your home to be able to buy the next house. Also, the solution to where you have time to complete the move so that it's not like, all right, my house sold today, I got to be moved out today. That's kind of crazy, right? So what you can do is have the real estate agent negotiate what's called a rent back. Basically, where the new buyer, they agree in the contract to rent the property back to Scott and Shelly for, a week, 2 weeks. By the way, if you haven't already, do me a huge favor. Smash that like button. Make sure to subscribe to my channel. And if you haven't already, leave your comments below. And if you're listening to this and you're like, gee, I kind of sound like Scott and Shelly, if you'd like to talk about your scenario, reach out to me directly. I'd love to be a resource for you. Tap the link below. You can schedule a free consultation on my calendar and we'll get you the answers you need to make an educated decision. So let's say that Scott and Shelly want to be more competitive as a buyer. They don't want to be contingent upon the sale of their property. All right, we got more moving parts now, more things to navigate. It's totally feasible, and this is actually something that we help people do quite often, because let's face it, being a contingent offer is not attractive for the majority of sellers out there. And we're in a very, very competitive market. So if you want to step your game up and be a competitive buyer when you really should be a contingent buyer, here's the solution. All right, so first things first, Scott and Shelly, like I mentioned, they need to tap into their existing home's equity in order to have a down payment for their next house. So what we did, we got Scott and Shelly a home equity line of credit, has zero prepayment penalty, and they can tap into up to 90% of their home's value. Basically, they're going to get the majority of their home's equity out of the property ahead of time. Bottom line is they now have access to their equity to make their down payment on the purchase. But here's the curveball. Even though Scott and Shelly can afford to handle both monthly payments, so they can handle the payment on the current property with the HELOC and their existing mortgage and the next house that they're going to buy, they don't want to do that forever, obviously, but they got enough money to to where they can do that for a period of time. Here's the thing though, they can't qualify as far as a mortgage goes for both deals. They can't keep their current house and also buy the next house and qualify for the mortgage. So what's the solution? How do we work around this? Well, this is where Scott and Shelly decided to tap into what is called the trade-in mortgage, which you can access through New Way Mortgage. We have an investor that will provide a binding cash offer to purchase your house. And the guidelines with Fannie Mae state that if you have a buyer, you're selling your house and the buyers release their contingencies and their loan is approved, which if the buyer doesn't need a loan, they're an accredited investor, then basically when you have that non-contingent binding offer, well, guess what? We don't have to include Scott and Shelly's current mortgage payment, the HELOC payment. None of that is counted in their debt ratio. So that clears the deck for them to be able to qualify for the next property. Now, the best thing about the trade-in mortgage, which I've done other videos about it before, but the best thing is that you're still going to use your real estate agent to sell the house. In fact, the company that provides the trade-in mortgage, they don't want to buy your house. They just want to charge you a small fee in exchange for them to provide that guaranteed offer so that you can basically hack the existing Fannie Mae guidelines and qualify for both properties. So Scott and Shelly are still going to be able to maximize their sales price and maximize the amount of equity that they're going to get out of the property. But by utilizing the trade-in mortgage, we were able to get them that HELOC so they got their down payment and make it to where they could qualify for the next property. And when their home sells and whatever money they have left over from their sale, most likely what they're going to do is apply that to their existing principal balance and do what is called a recast, where basically their new lender will reduce their monthly payment based off of how much they owe. And there you have it, folks. That's how you navigate that scenario and pull off selling your existing property, buying the next property, and not being homeless in the process. So whether you're like Scott and Shelly or you got a different scenario, I most likely have a solution for you, and I'd like to talk to you about it. So please click the link below, schedule a time on my calendar, and let's get you the information that you need to make an educated home buying decision. And if you haven't already, do me a huge favor. Tap that like button, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you on the next video.